The base sat on the edge of a wind-scoured valley, the kind of place where mornings started cold and stayed that way until noon. Sergeant Jessica Hale had been there 6 months, and in that time she had learned every crack in the motor pool concrete and every soldier's coffee order without trying. She was 32, sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet competence that didn't announce itself. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When Private Alvarez's transmission went out during a night exercise, it was Jessica who stayed past midnight helping him rebuild the paperwork so it wouldn't hit his record. When 2 soldiers in her platoon got into it over a bunk assignment, she settled it in 4 minutes flat, without picking a side, without anyone walking away resentful. She remembered birthdays. She remembered who had a kid sick at home and who needed an extra 30 seconds of patience that day. It hadn't taken long for the platoon to trust her. Trust, in the military, was currency, and Jessica had earned hers the slow way, through consistency, not charisma. She showed up. She followed through. She told the truth, even when it cost her something. Commander Reyes was a different kind of presence entirely. He'd been running the unit for 2 years before Jessica arrived, and in that time he'd built a reputation that had less to do with leadership and more to do with distance. He wore a watch that cost more than most of his soldiers made in a month. He drove an imported sedan that looked out of place next to the motor pool trucks. His dress uniform carried more ribbons than half the officers on base combined, though nobody could quite say which campaigns had earned him the newer ones. He didn't eat in the mess hall with the platoon. He didn't linger after briefings to ask how anyone was doing. He gave orders and expected them followed, and that was the extent of it. Jessica had noticed all of this the way she noticed everything, quietly, without comment, filing it away as information rather than judgment. It wasn't her place to like her commander. It was her place to do her job well, and she did. On a Tuesday evening in late October, that changed. She'd been sent to retrieve the unit's supply requisition folder from the commander's office. A routine errand, the kind she'd run a dozen times before. The door was cracked open. She knocked once out of habit and pushed it the rest of the way, already halfway through a sentence about the folder when she stopped. Commander Reyes was standing at the open platoon safe, a thin stack of bills folded in his hand. He was in the middle of sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jessica's eyes went from his face to his hand, to the safe, and back to his face. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The math was simple enough. The safe held the platoon's discretionary fund, small amounts collected for unit events, for flowers when someone's family member passed, for the modest things soldiers pooled money for because nobody else would. It wasn't a fortune. That wasn't the point. "This isn't what it looks like," Reyes said, and even as the words left his mouth, they sounded thin to both of them. He straightened his jacket, composed his face into something closer to authority. "I was moving funds for the maintenance request. Paperwork still catching up." Jessica held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable. She thought about the ledger she'd helped balance just 2 weeks earlier, the one that hadn't mentioned any maintenance transfer. She thought about the watch on his wrist, the car in the lot, the accessories that never seemed to match a commander's salary. She didn't argue with him. She didn't accuse him. She simply said, "I'll come back for the folder," and turned and left the room. The hallway outside his office was quiet, lit by the flat overhead fluorescence that made everything look a little washed out at that hour. Jessica walked its length slowly, her boots even against the tile, and she did not let her face show anything until she was well past the door. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't panicking. What she felt, more than anything, was a kind of cold clarity settling into place. The same feeling she got when a supply order didn't add up, when a report had a number in the wrong column. Something was wrong, and now she knew it. And knowing it meant she couldn't simply set it back down and walk away from it. She thought about the soldiers in her platoon, Alvarez, Chen, the new recruits who saluted Reyes without a second thought because they had no reason not to. She thought about the small, folded bills disappearing into a pocket that already had more than it needed. By the time she reached the end of the hallway, Jessica had made no decisions yet. But she had stopped pretending, even to herself, that she hadn't seen exactly what she'd seen. The days that followed moved with the strange double rhythm Jessica had come to expect from moments like this. Everything on the surface stayed exactly the same, while everything underneath had shifted completely. She ran her morning formations. She signed off on equipment checks. She sat with Private Chen for 20 minutes going over a personal problem that had nothing to do with the army and everything to do with a mother back home who wasn't doing well. And she gave the same steady attention she always did, because the platoon didn't deserve less just because her mind was elsewhere. But underneath it, she was working through the problem the only way she knew how, methodically. She wasn't naive about what she'd seen. She'd spent enough years around unit finances to know the difference between a transfer that hadn't been logged yet and money that was never coming back. She pulled the last quarter's discretionary fund records during a lunch break, cross-referenced them against what she remembered of the safe's contents, and found exactly what she expected to find. Gaps. Small ones, spread out, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Someone had been looking closely for a while, apparently. Someone had gotten comfortable. The upcoming meeting sat on her calendar like a fixed point she couldn't avoid. Representatives from the regional command were coming. A deputy general, a colonel, a scattering of lieutenant colonels and commanders from sister units. It was the kind of meeting that happened twice a year, where every unit presented its numbers and its projects and its case for continued resources. Jessica had been selected to speak for her platoon, an honor that had felt significant a month ago, and now felt almost beside the point. She had prepared her report the way she prepared everything, thoroughly, honestly, without embellishment. Training completion rates, equipment readiness. 2 junior soldiers she wanted to put forward for a commendation they'd earned and rarely gotten credit for. It was solid work, and she was proud of it, and now it sat in the same folder as a decision she hadn't wanted to make. She thought about going straight to the regional command with what she'd seen, bypassing Reyes entirely. But she had no hard proof beyond her own eyes. No documents, no confession, nothing that would hold up against a decorated commander's denial. She thought about saying nothing at all, letting it become someone else's problem eventually. But she kept coming back to the soldiers whose names were on that discretionary fund. The modest sums collected for a fallen soldier's family, for a retirement gift, for things that mattered more than their size suggested. It wasn't her money, but it was, in some way, her responsibility now. The same way anything she witnessed and failed to act on became her responsibility. 3 days before the meeting, she asked to speak with him privately. His office looked the same as it always had. Orderly, spare, more decoration than warmth. Reyes sat behind his desk and gestured for her to close the door, and if he was nervous about what this conversation might be, he didn't show it. "I wanted to give you the chance to handle this yourself," Jessica said. She kept her voice level, the same voice she used to deliver any report. "Before the meeting Thursday." "Handle what?" "You know what." He leaned back slightly. "Sergeant, I already explained." "You don't have to explain it to me," she said. "You have to decide what you're going to do about it. I'm not interested in making a scene. I'm not interested in ruining anyone's career for the sake of it. But I saw what I saw, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't." Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite fear, but a recalculation. "And if I don't agree with your version of events?" "Then you have until Thursday," Jessica said. "You can resign your post before the meeting. Personal reasons, health, whatever you want to call it. Nobody has to know why. Or I'll say what I saw in front of everyone who's coming, and you can explain it to them instead of me." He studied her for a long moment, and Jessica made herself hold still under it, the way she'd hold still under any inspection. She wasn't threatening him out of anger. She'd thought this through as carefully as she thought through anything, and this felt like the only path that didn't put her word alone against his in a room full of people who'd never met her. "You're making a mistake," Reyes said finally, quietly. "Maybe," Jessica said. Thursday will tell us which one of us is right. She left his office the way she'd left it before, without raising her voice, without slamming the door, without giving him anything to point to later except the plain fact of what she'd said. She went back to her platoon, back to her report, back to the ordinary work of the days between then and Thursday. But when Thursday morning came and she checked the personnel updates one last time before the meeting, there was no resignation on file, no transfer request, no sudden medical leave. Commander Reyes was still listed as presiding officer, same as always. And Jessica understood, standing in the hallway outside the briefing room with her folder under her arm, that she was going to have to do this the hard way after all. The briefing room had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of folding chairs replaced with proper seating, the unit's flags arranged along the back wall, a podium set up at the front with a screen for presentations. It smelled faintly of fresh coffee and floor polish, the kind of care that went into a room only when people from outside the base were coming to look at it. By 0800, the visiting officers had started arriving. Jessica watched from near the side entrance as a deputy general took his seat in the front row, flanked by two colonels she didn't recognize, and a cluster of lieutenant colonels who arranged themselves with the practiced hierarchy of people who knew exactly where they ranked relative to everyone else in the room. Commanders from 3 sister units filed in after them, exchanging handshakes and the kind of small talk that passed for warmth among people who saw each other twice a year. Jessica found a seat near the back, her folder resting on her knees, and ran through her report one more time in her head. Not because she needed to. She knew it cold, but because it gave her hands something to hold on to besides the tension building in her chest. She'd rehearsed this moment differently in her head over the past 3 days. She'd imagined delivering her report cleanly, the numbers and the commendations she'd fought to get her soldiers, and then, before stepping down, adding the words she hadn't wanted to say, but had decided she owed to everyone in that fund's ledger. She'd imagined Reyes's face when she said it. She hadn't imagined it would feel easy. Nothing about this had ever felt easy. But she'd made her peace with doing it the hard way, the honest way, in front of the people who could actually do something about it. Across the room, Reyes stood near the front, in conversation with the deputy general, composed and unreadable as always. If he was afraid of what was coming, he didn't let it touch his face. Jessica watched him laugh at something the general said and felt her resolve harden into something colder and steadier. The meeting opened on schedule. A lieutenant colonel ran through administrative matters, budget allocations, an update on a joint training exercise scheduled for spring, while Jessica sat through it with her eyes on her folder, barely registering the words. 2 other unit representatives gave their reports before her, one on logistics improvements, another on a recruitment initiative that had exceeded its targets. Polite applause followed each. Jessica's name was called next. She stood, smoothed the front of her uniform out of habit, and walked to the podium. The room's attention settled on her the way it always did before a report. Not unfriendly, just waiting. A room full of people accustomed to evaluating information quickly and moving on. She opened her laptop, brought up the first slide of her presentation, a simple title screen with her platoon's designation and the date, and looked out at the room. "Good morning," she said. "Before I get into my report, I want to make a brief announcement." A small ripple of attention moved through the room. People who had been checking their phones or glancing at their notes looked up. The deputy general's brow lifted slightly, curious. Jessica felt her pulse in her throat, but her voice held steady. She had rehearsed this moment. She had told herself she would not falter. She never got the chance to say the next sentence. Behind her, near the front row, she heard the scrape of a chair. She turned, along with most of the room, and saw Commander Reyes rising from his seat, not toward the podium, but toward her, and in his hand, impossibly, was a bouquet of red roses that someone must have hidden beneath his chair before the meeting began. For a moment, Jessica's mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. It didn't fit. Nothing about the room, the moment, The last 3 days had prepared her for a bouquet of flowers moving toward her across the tile floor. Then he was in front of her, lowering himself onto one knee, and the room around them shifted from confused silence into something warmer, softer, a collective intake of breath, the kind that precedes an occasion people are eager to celebrate. "Jessica," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, his voice carrying none of the coldness she'd seen in his office 3 nights earlier. "I know this isn't the moment either of us expected, but I didn't want to wait any longer to ask you something I've been certain of for a long time." She stood frozen at the podium, her laptop still open behind her, the title slide of her report glowing uselessly on the screen. Somewhere in the room, she registered a colonel leaning toward the officer beside him, whispering something with a smile. She registered the deputy general's expression softening into something almost fond. She registered, with a clarity that felt like ice water down her spine, exactly what Reyes had done, and exactly why he had done it. There was no ultimatum anymore. There was no accusation she could make in the next 30 seconds that would land as anything but scandal, or worse, jealousy. A jilted claim thrown out in the middle of her own commander's proposal, in front of every senior officer in the region. Whatever she said next, in this room, at this moment, would not be remembered as the truth. It would be remembered as the moment Sergeant Hale humiliated a decorated commander in front of his peers, on the day he asked her to marry him. Reyes held the roses up toward her, his expression arranged into something that, to everyone else in the room, must have looked like hope. Jessica felt the seconds pass, longer than seconds should feel. She thought about the safe. She thought about the ledger. She thought about every soldier in her platoon who trusted her to make the right call, and the terrible, narrow arithmetic of what right even meant in a room like this, in a moment like this. "Yes," she said finally, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. The room broke into applause before she'd even finished the word. Officers rising to their feet, someone letting out a cheer near the back, the deputy general himself clapping with what looked like genuine pleasure. Reyes rose from his knee, and Jessica let him take her hand, let him slide the ring from his pocket onto her finger while people she didn't know crowded forward with congratulations. She smiled, because the room expected her to smile, and underneath the smile, in the part of her face no one in that room was looking closely enough to see, Jessica understood exactly how thoroughly she had just been outmaneuvered. The celebration lasted the better part of an hour, officers lining up to shake Reyes's hand, a few of the visiting wives who'd come along for the regional social calendar clustering around Jessica to admire the ring, the deputy general himself offering a warm word about young love finding its way even in a life built around duty. Jessica moved through all of it the way she moved through inspections, saying the right things at the right moments, her face arranged into something that passed for happiness to anyone who wasn't looking too closely. Her report never got given. Somewhere in the shuffle of congratulations, someone had closed her laptop, and no one seemed to notice or care that 6 months of platoon achievements had gone unspoken. It didn't matter anymore. Not today. Today belonged to a different story entirely. One that had nothing to do with training numbers or the 2 soldiers she'd wanted recognized. It was nearly noon before the room finally emptied, the visiting officers filing out toward the mess hall for the reception lunch that had been arranged, and Jessica found herself alone with Reyes for the first time since he'd risen from one knee. The warmth left his face the moment the door closed behind the last departing colonel. "You can't get away with this," Jessica said. Her voice was quiet, flat, stripped of the performance she'd been giving all morning. "You think a ring changes what I saw?" "I think," Reyes said, straightening his jacket, "that you should consider your position a little more carefully than you have been." "My position? You're my fiancée now?" He said it simply, almost gently, the way he might explain a regulation to a new recruit. "Which means if you stand up in front of anyone, this command, the Inspector General, anyone, and say I've been taking money from the platoon fund, you're not a sergeant reporting misconduct anymore. You're a woman who had a fight with her husband and decided to get even. That's what it will look like. That's what everyone in that room today will remember, no matter what you actually say." Jessica said nothing. She didn't need to, because she'd already run the same calculation herself, standing at that podium with the roses in front of her. "Nobody will believe you," he continued, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "And even the people who might believe you won't be able to do anything about it because it'll look exactly like what I just said it would look like. So," he picked up his cap from the desk, unhurried, "I'd suggest you get used to the idea. It doesn't have to be terrible, Jessica. You'll want for nothing." She looked at him for a long moment, and what she felt wasn't the cold fury she might have expected. It was something quieter and more durable than that, the recognition of a problem that had just become considerably harder to solve, and underneath it, the stubborn refusal to accept that harder meant impossible. "I need to get back to my platoon," she said, and left the office without waiting for a response. The walk back across base felt longer than it was. The platoon area was busy with the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon. Alvarez running maintenance checks with two of the newer privates, Chen sorting through a supply manifest near the equipment shed, someone's radio playing low from an open barracks window. None of them knew yet. Word hadn't reached them, or if it hadn't been confirmed. And for a few strange minutes, Jessica moved through her own platoon as the person they'd always known her to be. Sergeant Hale, fair and steady, not yet the commander's fiancée, not yet a rumor waiting to become a headline. She let herself feel the strangeness of it. By tomorrow, or the day after, they would know, and something about the way they looked at her would shift, even if none of them meant it to. She would become, in some small measure, an extension of him in their eyes, and that was a cost she hadn't fully accounted for when she'd said yes at that podium. But standing there watching Alvarez wave off a private's question with an easy laugh, watching Chen frown over a manifest with the same careful attention Jessica had taught her to bring to every detail, something in Jessica's thinking settled into place. She had solved harder problems than this. Not through confrontation. Confrontation had just been taken off the table, cleanly and deliberately, by a man who understood exactly how rank and reputation worked. But through the same patient, unglamorous method she used for everything. Find the evidence, follow the paperwork, let the truth surface on its own timeline instead of hers. She didn't need to accuse him of anything. She needed the numbers to accuse him for her. That evening, after the platoon had stood down and the base had gone quiet, Jessica sat alone in the supply office with the discretionary fund ledgers spread across the desk in front of her. Records she had legitimate, unremarkable access to. The same records she cross-checked every month as part of her normal duties. Nothing about pulling them tonight would look unusual to anyone who noticed. She turned to the first page and began, patiently, to build the case that her own voice no longer could. The work took 3 weeks, and Jessica did almost none of it in a way that could be traced back to her. She started with what she already had legitimate access to, the monthly discretionary fund reconciliations that fell under her regular supply duties. She cross-referenced deposit dates against the small, ordinary transactions the fund was meant to cover. Flowers for a retiring master sergeant, a contribution toward a funeral for a soldier's father, the modest cost of a holiday dinner the platoon had put on for families who couldn't travel. Every one of those transactions had a receipt, a signature, a paper trail that made sense. What didn't make sense were the gaps. Withdrawals logged against categories that no one could quite account for, small enough individually to escape notice, consistent enough over 18 months to add up to something that mattered. She didn't stop there. Quietly, over her lunch breaks and the hour before evening formation, she began pulling maintenance requisition records too, the same ones Reyes had claimed, in his office that first night, to be transferring funds toward. She found no maintenance work that matched the dates or the amounts. She found, instead, a pattern that any honest audit would catch in an afternoon, if only someone with the authority to order one ever looked. Jessica didn't have that authority, but she knew who did. She thought carefully about how to get the information into the right hands without her own name attached to the accusation, Not out of fear for herself alone, but because she understood, with the same clarity she'd had in that briefing room, that anything traceable directly to her would be dismissed exactly the way Reyes had promised it would be. So she did what she'd always done well. She worked the system instead of fighting it. She flagged the discrepancies through the base's standard supply audit channel, the same quarterly process every unit went through, framed as routine reconciliation concerns rather than allegations. She made sure the numbers spoke plainly enough that whoever reviewed them wouldn't need her interpretation to understand what they were looking at. It took another 2 weeks after that for the Inspector General's office to open a formal review. By then, the questions had moved well beyond Jessica's original discovery. Auditors pulling maintenance contracts that didn't exist, comparing Reyes's reported expenses against a lifestyle that had never quite matched his pay grade. Jessica heard about most of it secondhand, the way everyone on base did, through the slow churn of rumor that preceded any official announcement. She kept her head down through all of it, ran her platoon, said nothing to confirm or deny what people were beginning to whisper. The engagement dissolved quietly, without the drama either of them might have expected a few weeks earlier. Once the investigation became public knowledge, there was no version of the story left in which Jessica marrying him made sense to anyone, least of all to Reyes, who requested a transfer of his own before the review had even concluded, as though distance might slow down what the paperwork had already set in motion. Jessica returned the ring through official channels, without ceremony, and neither of them spoke of it again. What surprised her, in the weeks that followed, wasn't the vindication, though there was a version of relief in watching the investigation confirm everything she'd known since that night in his office. What surprised her was how little she needed to say to her platoon for them to understand what had happened. Alvarez was the one who finally asked her directly, catching her alone near the motor pool one evening, and Jessica gave him the truth, plainly, the same way she gave him everything. "I didn't want to marry him," she said. "I said yes because I didn't have another move at the time. Then I found one." Alvarez didn't say much in response, just nodded slowly, the way soldiers do when they're recalibrating their understanding of someone they already respected. Word moved through the platoon after that the way it always did, quietly, without much need for embellishment, because the truth was straightforward enough on its own. If anything, Jessica's standing among them deepened rather than wavered. They'd trusted her before because she was fair and steady. Now they understood exactly what that fairness had cost her and what she'd been willing to carry alone to protect something that wasn't really about her at all. Reyes's replacement arrived 6 weeks later, and it was Jessica, unexpectedly, who'd had a hand in who filled the position. A first lieutenant from a sister unit, young, sharp, still early enough in her career to remember what it felt like to be the newest person in a room. Someone Jessica had worked alongside briefly during a joint exercise the year before, and had quietly recommended when the regional command asked her supply chain of the outgoing commander for input on the transition. It wasn't a formal decision. Not really. Jessica's name carried weight now in ways it hadn't 6 months earlier, and a passing conversation with the right colonel had been enough to put the lieutenant's name at the top of the list. The new commander showed up to her first platoon meeting in a uniform with far fewer ribbons than Reyes had worn, and she spent the first 20 minutes simply asking questions. About equipment, about morale, about who on the team needed what. Jessica watched from the back of the room and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully realized had been unsettled for months. That evening, walking the perimeter of the base alone in the last hour of daylight, Jessica thought about the version of herself who had stood at that podium 3 months earlier. Roses held out in front of her, a room full of people applauding a lie. She hadn't solved the problem the way she'd planned to. She hadn't gotten to stand up and say her piece in front of the people who mattered, hadn't gotten the clean, satisfying confrontation she'd rehearsed in her head the night before the meeting. But she'd solved it anyway. The slower way, the way that couldn't be waved off as a grudge or a lover's quarrel. The same way she solved everything, with patience and paperwork, and a refusal to let go of something just because the direct path had closed. It hadn't been the story she expected to be part of. It had, in the end, Still been the kind of story she could live with having told. And that's Sergeant Jessica Hale's story. A woman who didn't win with a raised voice, but with patience, paperwork, and the quiet refusal to give up. If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next story.